There are places in America where the air itself feels like a held breath, where the mountains press down on the valley floor with such permanence that the people living beneath them come to believe certain things will always be as they are, that the pines will always line the ridge in their dark rows, that the church on Main Street will always ring its bell at 7 in the morning, that a father will always come home. Shelby Creek, Idaho. Population 4,211. A timber and farming community nestled in the eastern finger of the Snake River Plain, roughly 40 miles from the Wyoming border, where the elevation sits at 5,000 feet and the winters arrive in October without apology. The kind of town where you know the name of the woman at the post office, where your children ride their bicycles to school, where a stranger's unfamiliar truck parked too long on a county road will prompt a neighbor's phone call before noon. It is, in every outward sense, the American small town that survives in the national imagination as something safe, something permanent, something watched over. On the morning of August 14, 1997, a 7-year-old girl named Melissa Harlan walked out the front door of her family's house on Cottonwood Lane at approximately 7:45 in the morning. She was carrying a red backpack. She was wearing her yellow sneakers, the ones with the small sunflower patch her mother had ironed onto the left toe. She was heading toward the end of the block where the school bus would pick her up at 7:58. The same as every Thursday since the school year had begun 2 weeks earlier. She never arrived at the bus stop. She was never seen again. For more than 22 years, the name Melissa Harlan would hang over Shelby Creek, Idaho, like weather. And then, on a Tuesday evening in March of 2019, a deputy with the Benton County Sheriff's Office knocked on a door that was very close to where the answer had been hiding all along. What kind of darkness can live so quietly, in a house you have driven past 1,000 times, that it survives for 2 decades without making a sound? To understand what happened in Shelby Creek in August of 1997, you first have to understand what Shelby Creek was. Not what it wanted to be. Not what the welcome sign on Route 12 advertised in hand-painted letters, "Welcome to Shelby Creek." A great place to grow, but what it actually was at 7:30 on a summer morning when the light came off the mountains in long flat bars, and the smell of pine resin and irrigation water hung over everything like a blessing. The town had been settled in the 1880s by logging families who followed the timber east from Oregon. And by the late 20th century, it still bore the shape of that origin. A main street that was 4 blocks long, a grain elevator at the south end of town visible from the highway, a Masonic lodge next to a Baptist church next to a gas station that also sold night crawlers and lottery tickets. The economy in 1997 was what economists would politely call transitional. The timber mills had been contracting since the mid-1980s, and a new call center had opened in the old hardware building downtown, employing about 60 people from the surrounding county. The median household income sat around $31,000 a year. Most families owned their homes. Most fathers worked. Most mothers either worked or stayed home with children, and the line between those two categories was understood to be a matter of practical necessity rather than personal choice. Cottonwood Lane was a residential street 2 blocks west of Main. The houses there were modest, wood-frame construction from the 1950s and 1960s, with deep front porches and chain-link or split-rail fences at the property lines. The Harlan family had lived at 408 Cottonwood Lane for 4 years. Thomas Harlan, 34, was a floor supervisor at a wood products facility on the edge of town. His wife, Joanna Harlan, 32, worked part-time at the school district's administrative office, 3 days a week. Their daughter Melissa was 7, enrolled in 2nd grade at Lincoln Elementary. Their son, Daniel, was 4 and still at home with Joanna on the mornings she did not work. Those who knew the Harlans described them the way you describe any family that has not yet given you reason to describe them more specifically. Nice people, quiet, kept to themselves without being unfriendly. Thomas coached youth baseball in the summer. Joanna brought food to the church potluck. Melissa was, by all accounts her teachers gave, a bright and sociable child who liked horses, liked drawing, and had recently announced to her second-grade class that she intended to become a veterinarian. She had a gap between her 2 front teeth. She laughed loudly enough that the neighbors could hear it through the fence on warm afternoons. August 14, 1997, was a Thursday. The morning was clear and cool, the way eastern Idaho mornings are in late summer before the sun clears the mountains and the temperature moves. The high that day would reach 71 degrees. There was no wind. The sprinkler systems on the lawns of Cottonwood Lane were finishing their morning cycle, and the smell of wet grass mixed with the faint diesel exhaust of a passing farm truck on the adjacent road. Thomas Harlan had left for work at 6:15, the same as every weekday. He drove a 1994 blue Ford pickup. According to his time card, he clocked in at the mill at 6:42. Joanna had given Melissa her breakfast, cereal, orange juice, a piece of toast with butter, at approximately 7 o'clock. She dressed Melissa in her school clothes, the blue jeans and the striped shirt that would later be documented in the missing persons report in the clinical language of law enforcement. Denim jeans, blue, size 7/8, shirt, cotton, horizontal stripes, blue and white. She helped Melissa pack her backpack. She kissed her daughter on the top of her head. At 7:45, Joanna Harlan stood at the front door and watched Melissa walk down the porch steps, turn left at the gate latch, and proceed up the sidewalk in the direction of the corner where Cottonwood Lane met Birch Avenue, 140 yards away. That was where the bus stop was. Joanna watched her daughter walk approximately 30 yards before turning back into the house to attend to Daniel, who was asking for more juice. The school bus arrived at the corner of Cottonwood and Birch at 7:56. The driver, a retired postal worker named Glenn Tate, noted that Melissa was not at the stop. This was unusual enough that he waited an additional 2 minutes before pulling away. He did not call it in. He assumed Melissa was home sick and that the school office would be notified in the usual way. At 9:12 in the morning, the attendance office at Lincoln Elementary called the Harlan residence to report Melissa's absence. Joanna Harlan answered the phone. For a moment, those who know her describe it as a moment that lasted approximately 4 seconds, though she would later say it felt like stepping off a ledge. She could not understand what the woman on the phone was telling her. Then she understood. She called Thomas at the mill. She called a neighbor. She called 911 at 9:27. The Benton County Sheriff's Department dispatched deputies to Cottonwood Lane at 9:31. The first deputy on the scene, a 6-year veteran of the department named Carl Reyes, walked the route between the Harlan house and the bus stop 4 times before noon. 140 yards of sidewalk, mature elm trees on both sides, no fences that blocked the view from the street, 3 houses along the route with clear sightlines to the sidewalk. 140 yards, and no one had seen anything. The swing in the Harlan backyard hung still in the morning air. The toy truck that Daniel had left at the gate the evening before lay on its side in the grass. Everything was ordinary. Everything was exactly as it should have been, except for the one thing that was not. Search operations began within the hour. By noon, there were volunteers. By 3 in the afternoon, the parking lot of the Lutheran Church on Maple Street was serving as a staging area, and more than 200 residents of Shelby Creek had shown up to walk grids through the adjacent fields and irrigation canals. The Benton County Search and Rescue Team deployed with dogs. The Idaho State Police sent a detective. The school district closed Lincoln Elementary for the afternoon and urged parents to collect their children personally. By nightfall on August 14, 1997, Melissa Harlan had been missing for approximately 12 hours. Her red backpack had not been found. Her yellow sneakers had not been found. There was no physical evidence at the scene, no witnesses, and no indication in the 140 yards between her front gate and the bus stop that anything had happened at all. The church bell rang at 7 the next morning, the same as always. But something in Shelby Creek had shifted permanently, the way a bone does when it breaks and heals and is never quite the same angle again. You could hear it in the way people's voices dropped when they said her name. You could see it in the way mothers stood at their doors and watched the bus stop with something new in their faces. Something had come through this town, and it had come in the daylight on an ordinary street, and no one had seen its face. Part 2. The investigation. Search and growing suspicions. Clears throat. The search for Melissa Harlan was, by the account of every law enforcement officer involved, one of the largest coordinated operations in Benton County's modern history. Within 48 hours of her disappearance, the effort had grown to include the Idaho State Police, the FBI's Salt Lake City field office, search and rescue teams from 3 adjacent counties, and more than 400 volunteers. Cadaver dogs covered the creek beds and irrigation canals within a 5-mile radius. A Cessna from the county's Civil Air Patrol flew grid patterns over the surrounding farmland and timber tracts. Flyers with Melissa's school photograph, the one from the previous spring, where she was wearing a pink dress and the gap in her teeth is visible in her wide smile, were posted in every business window from Shelby Creek to the state line. The FBI assigned Special Agent Diane Kowalski out of the Pocatello Resident Agency to assist the local investigation. According to agency records, Agent Kowalski arrived in Shelby Creek on August 15 and immediately established a command post at the Benton County Courthouse. She began what investigators call victimology work, a methodical reconstruction of Melissa's world, her routines, the people she knew, the routes she traveled, the adults who had regular access to her. The initial focus, as it always is in child disappearance cases, was on the family. This is not cruelty. This is mathematics. The FBI's own statistics from that period showed that in the majority of child abduction and homicide cases, the perpetrator is known to the victim. The first circle investigators draw is always the one closest in. Thomas Harlan was interviewed at the sheriff's office on August 15, the morning after Melissa's disappearance. He had been at the mill since 6:42. His time card confirmed it. His supervisor confirmed it. 2 coworkers confirmed it. He had not left the facility until receiving the phone call from Joanna at 9:40, at which point he had driven directly home. His truck's odometer reading was documented. The math of his timeline held. He was interviewed again on August 17. He was cooperative. He was composed in a way that struck Agent Kowalski as disciplined, though she noted at the time that people express shock differently, and she did not allow herself to read too much into the quality of a man's composure. He answered every question. He volunteered information. He asked twice when they were going to find her. Those who knew Thomas Harlan in the days following the disappearance described 2 different men, depending on who was doing the describing. His coworkers said he was devastated, quiet, and hollow-eyed, going through the motions at the mill while clearly absent in everything that mattered. His neighbors on Cottonwood Lane said largely the same. But deputies whispered quietly, in the early days, about something that did not quite cohere. The way Thomas Harlan sat at the command post with the other volunteers and seemed, beneath the surface of his grief, to be watching the investigators, watching the flow of information, Not the way a frantic father watches for news, but the way a man watches when he already knows the ending of a story and is waiting to see how long it takes everyone else to catch up. It was a small thing. It was the kind of thing that gets dismissed 100 times before it becomes relevant. Agent Kowalski documented 3 interviews with Thomas Harlan in her case notes over the first 2 weeks. Her internal observation, recorded on August 19, read, "Subject demonstrates appropriate emotional affect when asked about victim, but exhibits notably controlled behavioral baseline during timeline questioning. No deception indicators confirmed. Recommend continued attention to stated movements on morning of 8/14. That question of movements was where the first inconsistency emerged. Thomas Harlan had told investigators he left the house at 6:15 and drove directly to work. The mill was 11 miles from 408 Cottonwood Lane by the most direct route, taking approximately 14 minutes. His time card showed a clock-in of 6:42. That was a gap of 27 minutes for a 14-minute drive. When asked about this, Thomas said he had stopped for gas. He named the station, the Cenex on Route 12, 3 miles from the mill. Investigators obtained the Cenex transaction records. There was no purchase made on a card associated with Thomas Harlan on the morning of August 14. He was asked if he had paid cash. He said he believed he had. Investigators asked the station attendant, a young woman named Priya Mehta, if she recalled him. She did not. A 27-minute gap for a 14-minute drive. A gas stop with no receipt and no witness. It was nothing. It was absolutely nothing, except that it was the only thing that didn't add up, and in an investigation with no physical evidence, no witnesses, and no scene, the things that don't add up become the things you carry home with you at night and set on the nightstand and look at in the dark. The second inconsistency was smaller still. Thomas Harlan had told the first responding deputy, Carl Reyes, that he had not yet eaten breakfast when he left for work, that Joanna had been focused on getting Melissa ready, and he had simply grabbed his coffee and left. But a neighbor, Elena Frisk, who had been watering her roses at approximately 6:10 that morning, mentioned in her statement that she had seen Thomas backing out of the driveway and had noticed, through the open garage, what appeared to be 2 cereal bowls on the kitchen table. This detail was so minor that it was recorded in the supplemental report and noted as unverified. Elena Frisk could not be certain what she had seen. She was 68 feet away. The garage door had been open only briefly. But that was the thing about details in this investigation. They were like single threads, too thin to hold anything on their own, easy to dismiss one at a time. It was only much later that anyone would try holding them all together. On September 4, 1997, 3 weeks after Melissa's disappearance, the search operation formally scaled back. The volunteers went home. The FBI liaison returned to Pocatello. The Idaho State Police detective handed the case back to Benton County. Deputy Carl Reyes, who had walked that 140 yards of sidewalk more times than he could count, wrote in his closing summary, "No witnesses, no physical evidence recovered, no confirmed scene, no suspect identified. Case remains open." He signed it and filed it and went home and sat in his truck in his own driveway for a long time before going inside. Melissa Harlan was 7 years old. She had wanted to be a veterinarian. She had a gap in her teeth and yellow sneakers with a sunflower on the left toe. The case went cold on a Tuesday in September, when the cottonwood trees on Cottonwood Lane were just beginning to turn. Part 3, The Silence. Years passing, life after. Clears throat. Jump forward. It is now the spring of 2000, 2 years, 8 months since the morning. Shelby Creek has absorbed the grief the way small towns absorb things slowly, incompletely, with the grief becoming part of the landscape rather than resolving. The flyer in the window of the Senex station has faded to the color of old paper. Children who started school the fall after Melissa's disappearance are now in the 5th grade. The church bell still rings at 7. Joanna Harlan had left Shelby Creek in March of 1999, taking Daniel, who was 6 by then, to live near her mother in Twin Falls, 300 miles to the southwest. The departure was described publicly as a family decision, that staying in the house on Cottonwood Lane was too painful, that Joanna needed her family's support, that the distance from the place where Melissa had last walked was a necessary mercy. Neighbors said goodbye to her in the way that people do when there is something more to say that no one has the language for. Thomas Harlan stayed. This was the first thing that people would mention years later when they tried to reconstruct the shape of that period. He stayed in the house on Cottonwood Lane. He kept his job at the mill. He kept his routines. He stopped coaching youth baseball. He became quieter, more solitary, but he stayed. And the town let him stay because grief is not a crime. And there was nothing to say that his staying was anything other than the stubbornness of a man who could not yet leave the last place his daughter had been. Joanna Harlan and Thomas Harlan separated formally in late 1998. Their divorce was finalized in February of 2000. The proceedings were handled through a mediator, not a courtroom. The settlement was uncomplicated. Daniel went with his mother. For those who have ever doubted someone they love, held a suspicion so shapeless that you had no name for it, carried a weight you could not describe to anyone, because describing it would have made it real. The space between Joanna Harlan's departure and the moment of revelation is a geography that requires no map. It is simply the lived experience of not knowing, of waking up every day inside a question that has no answer yet, of looking at the face of the person you shared a life with and trying to read something that may or may not be written there. Joanna Harlan, in an interview she gave to a regional news outlet in 2003, described those years in language that was deliberate and careful. She said she had been working to move forward. She said Daniel was doing well in school. She said she thought about Melissa every day and that she kept a photograph on the dresser and another on the kitchen windowsill. She did not discuss Thomas. She was asked once if she had any theories about what had happened, and she looked at the interviewer for a long moment with an expression that the interviewer would later describe as something between knowledge and exhaustion, and she said simply, "I believe someone who knew my daughter took her. I believe that. I've always believed that." The interviewer moved on. The piece ran in a Sunday supplement. It was read and forgotten. Daniel Harlan grew up in Twin Falls. He was a quiet child who slept with the light on until he was 9. His teachers described him as thoughtful and a little shy, good at reading, prone to long silences. He drew horses, not because he had any particular connection to horses, but because, as he told his grandmother once, his sister had liked them and drawing them made him feel that she was still somewhere nearby. He had nightmares that he described to Joanna, when he described them at all, as the same dream, without ever elaborating on the content. He attended his father's birthday dinners twice a year with the careful neutrality of a child who has learned to exist in 2 separate emotional climates. In 2007, Daniel was 14. He had begun to ask questions that he had not asked before, not of Joanna directly, but in the way teenagers ask questions, sidelong and persistent, about the past. He asked to see news articles about Melissa's disappearance. He asked about the investigation. He asked once in the car on the way home from a school event why his father had stayed in the house. Joanna answered him as honestly as she could. She said she did not know. She said some people needed to be near the place they had lost someone. She gripped the steering wheel and kept her eyes on the road. 3 months later, Daniel came to his mother with something. He had been doing his own searching, the kind of searching that becomes possible in the digital age, when a teenager with an internet connection can access court records, public filings, old newspaper archives. He had found the divorce filing. He had found in the divorce settlement documentation a property listing that had never come up in conversation. A parcel of 47 acres of forested land in the hills above town, approximately 9 miles from Shelby Creek, which Thomas Harlan had transferred into his own name in October of 1997. 6 weeks after the investigation into Melissa's disappearance had gone cold. The parcel was listed in the divorce filing as a premarital asset. Joanna Harlan had not known about this land. She sat with this information for 3 days. She did not call Thomas. She did not call the sheriff's office. She did not tell Daniel what she was thinking. She sat with it the way you sit with something when you are not yet sure whether it is what you think it might be, when you are still hopping it as something else, when the alternative is a truth so large and so final that admitting it means every day of your life since that August morning has been something different than what you believed. On the 4th day, she called a lawyer in Twin Falls. Part 4, The Revelation. Truth emerges. Clears throat. The case of Melissa Harlan did not reopen because of a dramatic confession, or a forensic breakthrough, or a witness emerging from the years of silence with something they had been too afraid to say. It reopened because of a 16-year-old boy doing homework at the kitchen table. In February of 2009, Daniel Harlan, now 16, had been assigned a genealogy project for his history class. The assignment required him to compile a family history going back at least 3 generations, including photographs and documents. In the course of gathering this material from his grandmother's attic in Twin Falls, he found a shoebox that contained, among other family photographs and papers, a folded piece of paper that his grandmother had kept without fully understanding its significance. It was a hand-drawn map. It had been drawn in pencil on the inside of a paper bag. It showed a property, a square with a creek line on one side, a dirt road on another, a cluster of hatched marks that represented trees and an X. Daniel's grandmother could not say where the paper had come from. She believed it had been in a pocket of a coat she had laundered after Thomas Harlan's last visit, years earlier, a coat he had left behind. She had not thought much of it. She had put it in the shoebox. Daniel looked at the map for a long time. He brought it to his mother. Joanna Harlan looked at the map and then looked at her son and did not say what she was thinking, because what she was thinking was something that, once spoken aloud, could never be taken back. Instead, she called the Twin Falls office of the Idaho State Police. The detective who took her call was a 12-year veteran named Roger Sims. He listened to Joanna's account without interrupting. He asked her to bring in both the map and the divorce documentation showing the property transfer. She arrived the next morning. Detective Sims spent the afternoon cross-referencing the map with county survey records against the property parcel listed in the Harlan divorce filing. By 4 o'clock, he had a preliminary match. By the end of the week, he had contacted the Benton County Sheriff's Office and requested that the cold case file on Melissa Harlan be pulled from storage and transferred to active status. Benton County Sheriff Martin Alcott authorized the reactivation of the case on March 2, 2009. He assigned Detective Sims and a Benton County investigator, Carol Lang, as co-leads. Agent Kowalski, now a senior agent in the FBI's Salt Lake Field office, agreed to provide consultation. The cold case unit of the Idaho State Police provided forensic support. The team spent 2 weeks preparing before moving on the property. They obtained a search warrant on March 17, 2009, on the basis of the property's undisclosed ownership, the map, and the original case files unresolved timeline inconsistencies. The Benton County judge who signed the warrant reviewed the materials for 45 minutes before signing. The property was a parcel of 47 acres in the timbered foothills northeast of Shelby Creek. Access was by a logging road that had been decommissioned in 1992. A gate across the road bore a padlock that, when tested, accepted the key found on a ring in the Benton County evidence vault, the same keyring that had been removed from Thomas Harlan's truck during the 1997 investigation and returned to him when the investigation went cold. A key that had never been identified as belonging to any lock in the Harlan household. Search teams entered the property on March 19, 2009, at 7 in the morning. The air was cold and the trees were still bare, and the search dogs went to work through the pine duff and the creek bed with the methodical intensity of animals who do not understand the significance of what they are doing, who only know that they are following something real. At 11:47 in the morning, one of the dogs alerted near the base of a rock, outcropping approximately 230 yards from the logging road, in a depression that had been partially covered by a flat stone and years of accumulated debris. The forensic team worked the site for 4 hours before the medical examiner arrived. The evidence recovered was consistent with the remains of a child. Positive identification was made through dental records on March 21, 2009. Melissa Harlan had been on that hillside for 11 years, 9 miles from the house on Cottonwood Lane, 9 miles from the gap in her teeth and the yellow sneakers and the red backpack. 9 miles from the morning, she walked down the porch steps and turned left at the gate latch. Clears throat. Thomas Harlan was taken into custody on March 24, 2009, at his residence on Cottonwood Lane in Shelby Creek, Idaho. He was arrested by a joint team comprising 2 Benton County deputies, Detective Lang and Detective Sims. The arrest was made at approximately 7 in the evening. Neighbors on Cottonwood Lane, who had been watching the house since word had begun to travel through the town on the day the property search made the evening news, saw him walk out the front door and down the porch steps with his hands already raised, as though he had known, for a long time, that this moment would eventually come. He said nothing. Those who were present described his face as still, not shocked, not angry, still in the way that something is still when it has been waiting. A neighbor, a woman who had lived 2 doors down from the Harlans for 12 years, told a reporter afterward, "He brought casseroles to our porch when my husband had surgery. He shoveled our walk without being asked. I have been trying to put those 2 things in the same sentence for 11 years, and I still cannot do it." That is the thing about these cases that no documentary, no summary, no account can fully capture. The dissonance between the face that a community knows and the truth that was hidden behind it. For those who have ever sat with a version of this dissonance, who have loved someone and later had to reckon with what that love had been built on, the vertigo of it does not require explanation. It is simply one of the most difficult human experiences there is. The Shelby Creek community's reaction split along the fault line that always appears in these moments. There were those who said they had always known something was wrong, who cited the 27-minute gap and the composure at the command post and the staying in the house after Joanna left. And there were those who could not accept it, who had been Thomas Harlan's co-workers and his neighbors and his church acquaintances, who had watched him walk through 11 years of apparent grief and could not now reconstruct those years into something that accommodated this new truth. Both reactions are honest. Both are human. Neither fully accounts for what actually happened on a sidewalk on an August morning in 1997. The charges filed against Thomas Harlan included first-degree homicide and the unlawful concealment of a deceased person. At his arraignment on March 27, 2009, he entered a plea of not guilty. He was held without bail. His defense attorney requested a change of venue, citing the impossibility of an impartial jury in Benton County. The motion was denied. Trial was scheduled for January 2010. The trial lasted 19 days. The prosecution's case rested on 5 pillars: the timeline discrepancy on the morning of August 14, 1997, the undisclosed ownership of the property and the timing of its transfer, the key on his keyring that fit the gate lock, the hand-drawn map found in Joanna Harlan's possession, and the forensic evidence recovered from the site. The defense argued that the map was ambiguous, that the property transfer predated the disappearance, that a father's decision to retain land was not evidence of wrongdoing, and that the prosecution was building an inference structure on a foundation of circumstance. The defense was not wrong that the case was largely circumstantial. It was also not enough. Joanna Harlan testified on the 6th day of trial. She spoke for 3 hours. She described the morning of August 14, 1997, with the precision of someone who had lived inside that morning for 11 years. She described the yellow sneakers. She described watching Melissa walk to the end of the block. She described turning away. She described the phone call from the school and the 4 seconds before she understood and everything that followed. She did not look at Thomas Harlan while she testified. She looked at the jury. Her voice did not break. Daniel Harlan, now 16 years old, sat in the gallery beside his grandmother and did not testify. He was not required to. He had already done, in a kitchen in Twin Falls with a shoebox full of old papers, the most important thing he would ever do in service of his sister's memory. He sat very still through the 19 days of trial, and those who saw him there said he had his mother's eyes and something in the set of his jaw that was harder to name. On January 29, 2010, the jury deliberated for 11 hours across 2 days. They returned a verdict of guilty on both counts. Thomas Harlan received a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He was led out of the Benton County Courthouse at 4 in the afternoon. The sky was the color of old iron. It was going to snow. There is a particular quality to justice when it arrives late. It does not feel like resolution in the way we imagine resolution when we are young and believe that closure is a door that can actually be closed. It feels, those who have lived it say, more like finally being given permission to put something down that you have been carrying for so long that the carrying had become a part of who you are. You put it down and your hands feel wrong for a while, and you have to learn again how to be a person who is not holding that weight. Joanna Harlan was 44 years old when the verdict was read. She walked out of the courthouse in Shelby Creek, the same town where Melissa had been a child, the same town she had left 12 years earlier on a March afternoon when the snow was still on the ground, and stood on the courthouse steps for a moment before her lawyer took her arm. Daniel was beside her. He was taller than her now by half a foot. She looked up at the sky, and then she looked at her son, and they walked to the car together. Melissa Harlan would have been 19 years old in 2009. She had wanted to be a veterinarian. She had liked drawing horses. She had walked out her front door on a summer morning with her red backpack and her yellow sneakers, and she had loved the world with the open trust of a 7-year-old who had not yet been given a reason not to. Her name deserves to be remembered, not as a case number, not as a cautionary tale, not as the subject of a documentary, but as a child who existed, who was loved, who mattered, who still matters to a mother who put her photograph on the kitchen windowsill and a brother who drew horses to keep her close. There are still cold cases in Idaho. There are still names in file folders in county sheriff's offices, in the inventory of the Idaho State Police Cold Case, an Advanced DNA Methods Unit, in the playing cards distributed through state correctional facilities. Names that belong to real people who had morning routines and favorite foods and voices that their families can still hear, exactly, in the silence. Someone knows something about each of those cases. Someone has a piece of information they believe is too small to matter, or too old to matter, or too dangerous to speak. It is not too small. It is not too old. There is no such thing as too late to give someone's family the truth. Music, the piano note returns, sustained, then resolved. The swing on Cottonwood Lane was taken down in 2010. The house was sold. The new owners planted a rose bed along the front walk. Every August on the 14th, Joanna Harlan drives from Twin Falls to a hillside in the Benton County foothills and leaves flowers at the place where the rock outcropping meets the old creek line, in the shade of the pine trees, where it is quiet enough that you can hear everything. She has never missed a year.